Hello, everyone, and welcome to the SAG-AFTRA podcast. I'm Duncan Crabtree-Ireland, SAG-AFTRA National Executive Director and Chief Negotiator. And recently, I had the privilege of hosting a fascinating panel discussion at South by Southwest in Austin, Texas, titled The Future of Hollywood in an AI-Saturated World. The panel brought together leaders from different entertainment unions to discuss how we're addressing the challenges of AI in the absence of comprehensive federal or even state legislation. I was joined by an exceptional group of colleagues. Sam Wheeler, who's the executive director of the WGA East, Vanessa Holtgrew, the international vice president and assistant department director for motion picture and television production of IATSE, and Rebecca Ryan, the associate national executive director and Western executive director of the DGA. Our conversation covered a wide range of topics, from the specific protections we've secured in our recent contracts to our vision for how AI might actually strengthen rather than diminish our creative industries. We also shared our perspectives on what AI's ultimate legacy might be for Hollywood and the broader entertainment landscape. So let's listen in.
Why don't we go ahead and kick it off, and let's talk a little bit about how people who work in labor, people who think about workers' issues and creative talent issues on a daily basis. What's on your mind about protecting people with respect to AI? And I want to specifically focus that on what type of AI protections have you either negotiated into recent contracts or have you been thinking about as you envision future contract negotiations that are coming up for each of you? I think for this one, I'm going to start it off with Vanessa, if I may.
Yes. So we followed, our major negotiations followed the other industry guilds in 2024, and we came in with quite a few AI proposals, as you can imagine. Some of the things that we achieved in that was a big issue for us is when someone is assigned the use of an AI tool, it is very clearly laid out in our contract now. That's covered work. There's no question about it. We've had, unfortunately to say, in the past, sometimes the studios take the position that new technology means it's not covered, and then you spend years fighting to get it covered. AI is covered work. Other elements that we got a really interesting one that I'm not sure the other unions and guilds got because it's kind of specific to the work we do, that if an employee, the producer cannot use their prompts that they use in an AI tool to replace that worker or other workers. So they could not take an editor's prompt, say, recreate how an editor edits and get rid of them. That was something we achieved. And then something a lot of us shared was that we got meetings with the employers throughout the life of the contract, both as the large group, the AMPTP it's called, that's all the studios, but also specific meetings if we need them with specific studios. Ask them, how are you using this? Discuss issues that are arising. We also got the development of work training programs. That is currently in process as this technology begins to be used. We will develop ways to both educate folks who are using those tools and do any reskilling or upskilling we need to do. So that will be an ongoing process.
I think that's a really great point that's embedded in what you just said. And I think it's something that all of us share in common is the fact that part of knowing how to attack these problems is actually knowing what is happening. And that requires an intense amount of commitment of effort and energy on the part of your team, but it also requires the folks on the other side of the table to actually be forthcoming about what they're doing. And I think many of us have embedded that type of contract language, like you just described, Vanessa, into our agreements. But also, like you said, there's some things that are unique to the IATSE agreements. I think there are some things that are unique to all of our agreements as it relates to AI. So Sam, why don't I pop it over to you on that same question, that's sort of maybe following off that theme. Is there anything that you think is particularly unique to writers that is embedded in your AI protections that you have now or that you're thinking about looking for in the future?
Yeah, thank you. I think in addition to representing folks who work in film and television, under the under what we call the MBA, we also have members who, like SAG-AFTRA, work in broadcast journalism and who work in online media, and those have primarily been the contracts that have come up in the last several years. And I bring them up here in a panel on Hollywood in an AI saturated future, because I think that some of the lessons and some of the approaches that we've been thinking about are applicable to how this is going to be deployed in the film and television industry. When we go to the table to negotiate on AI, we think about safeguarding members' jobs, their compensation, their dignity at work, but we also increasingly find ourselves standing up for their profession itself. To standing up for the basic tenets of the profession that they have dedicated their lives and their talents to. So to give you one example, we just concluded an agreement with ABC News, which we hope will be a precedent setting CBA in the news industry. And there are some really interesting provisions in there that are really more directed at integrity of journalism than they are at anybody's individual terms and conditions of employment. So to give you one example, we have a provision in that agreement that no journalist has to share a byline on a piece that has AI components on it. We have components in the ABC agreement that make sure that if AI is deployed to do news gathering, that it be held to the same standards, the same ethical standards that our members who are journalists are also held to. So when we think about Hollywood and we think about film and television, I think that some of those same tenets apply, which is that this is a tool. It's unlikely to be going anywhere, but we have to think about not just safeguarding jobs and safeguarding wages, but safeguarding the craft that has brought us this amazing industry that we all care so much about.
It's such a great point. It actually reminds me that in 2023, before the big strikes of your sibling union, the Writers Guild West and SAG-AFTRA that year, at the Writers Guild Awards, they actually gave a fake Writers Guild Award to ChatGPT for having allegedly written the script for this horrendous little clip that they produced for that. So clearly that's been a concern at the forefront of writers' minds since really the inception of it being understood that generative AI and LLMs were going to have that kind of capability.
The fact that this technology was built on wholesale theft of my members' work has meant that we have to be aware of it, right? I mean, all of these models were trained on written content produced by writers without compensation. Nobody asked for it. Nobody has set up something to pay them. And so when you see that that's how it's created, you immediately have to shift to, okay, well, how is this going to be deployed?
Yeah, there are probably people in this audience who that may be the first time they've thought about it in that way, right? Or even considering thinking about it in that way. And they may disagree strongly with that statement. But if you do disagree strongly with that statement, I guess what I would say to you is think about how it would feel to you if your life's work were essentially taken without anyone asking or even acknowledging you, much less paying you for it, and then used to create some other work. It is something that I think is really worth considering.
One of the things that's always worth thinking about is this is an industry that has a long history of disruption by technology, and it's very adaptable, and it will adapt again. The DGA has a particular focus on economic and creative rights. So as everyone up here has talked about, of course, it's about preserving employment and jobs. Of course, it's about not allowing the technology to replace people. But we also have, particularly our directors, who will want to use this technology in a way that it enhances their creativity, and we want them to be able to do that. And the question really is not the whether, it's the how. And when you think about what we focused on in negotiations, like everyone else, we focused on the access to the decision makers and the subject matter experts at the studios to have these conversations with, so we knew what was happening and what the plans were. But also we had two core principles, which was consent and compensation. And I think that also flows through, although all of our members have different concerns about the ways in which AI will impact us, I think those two principles flow through all of the agreements. The other thing that was mentioned by Sam is integrity. And we have a very strong bias towards our members' work and protecting the story they want to tell, not having that story mutilated or told differently. And we've had these fights in situations with colorization, or in situations where there was a movement a few years back called clean flicks, so we a movie, you take everything out of a movie that made it interesting, and then you would show it would be family friendly, right? And so we have fought traditionally against the director's vision being compromised by technology, and that will be the same fight.
Yeah, and I think it's well known, certainly well known by me, that the Directors Guild has an extraordinary level of contractual accomplishment and protection with respect to creative rights. I think certainly I would love to have the level of creative rights protection in our collective bargaining agreements that the DGA has, including the ability to negotiate directly with studio executives who are involved in the creative process, as opposed to, just so you know, a lot of us do tend to have to negotiate, we get to negotiate with labor relations executives, which are mostly like lawyers who are specifically hired by these companies to negotiate with talent, but who themselves know a lot about the businesses, but are not directly involved. And so one of the things the Directors Guild has been successful at is getting the ability on creative issues to focus in those negotiations. And I guess one thing I'm wondering as well, based on what you just said, Rebecca, is does that mean that you have been successful in getting the creative rights negotiations sort of attached to AI and having those conversations with that group of folks?
It's funny, we were already in negotiations, and sort of all of a sudden AI rose from the ground to become a very serious issue. And so we were able to pivot. We did have those conversations. We are having those meetings, but I think in the next round, we're really going to have a sense of how the intersection between creative rights and the use of AI, how they really come together.
And in the case of SAG-AFTRA, we do have some unique considerations because obviously image, likeness, and voice are particular concerns of our members, and they are particularly impacted by the capability, particularly of generative AI systems, that's a lot of particularities, but of generative AI systems to replicate their performance. And so we ended up having major negotiations. When you say AI kind of sprang from the ground, I remember that happening during the DGA negotiations, but also in our case, we were anticipating, I think, because of the early adoption of AI technologies to replicate performances. Think back to things as far back as Paul Walker in Fast and Furious or Carrie Fisher in Star Wars movies, et cetera. This was happening well before the November 2022 release of ChatGPT and everyone going bonkers about generative AI. So we were actually working on and preparing for that negotiation for a long time with respect to our thoughts about AI. But we do have a common philosophy, even though we have different implementations of that philosophy. And likewise, ours is informed consent and fair compensation. And that was what we were fighting for in that negotiation. And what's funny to me is now, several years later, mostly, with the exception of the video game companies, sorry to say, but the music industry, film and television, have all gotten on board with those concepts. We may fight over implementation, but there's really not a lot of pushback on the concepts there. And I think that's so important. And especially from our members' point of view, consent, like if your face or your voice or your body is going to be used in some way that you didn't actually do yourself, you need to have the right to say yes or no to that. That's fundamental to sort of controlling your ability to be your own person. And in the old days, even if you had a contract that said, I'm going to be part of this project or whatever, if there was something you didn't want to do, you just didn't do it. And you knew if you didn't do it, it wasn't going to end up on screen. If you didn't say it, it wasn't going to end up in the audio track of the project. But in case you haven't noticed, that is no longer true. So the fact that you didn't do it doesn't mean it's not going to look like you did it or sound like you did it. And that's why those rights are just so crucial.
Just a small thing. So just so everybody's aware, so us, the Writers Guild East and the Writers Guild West, we jointly negotiate the MBA. So we were out with you guys too.
Right, of course, absolutely. Thank you I should have been better about that in explaining that. So we've sort of touched on collective bargaining. From my point of view, there's like two peas in a pod here, and the other pea in that pod is public policy. Because as powerful as collective bargaining is, and let me just put a plug in for it to say, we had rules about AI in collective bargaining in, I think, probably every single one of the contracts represented up here and a whole bunch of others. We still barely have rules for AI at all in public policy in this country. We've gotten a few laws enacted in California, New York. Federal government is still working on it, and it's been years. So collective bargaining has proved to be one of the fastest ways to actually implement enforceable real-world protections. But it has its limits because it only controls the people who are parties to those collective bargaining agreements. So hence we need public policy, which can go further than that. And Rebecca, let me turn to you first on this, if I may. What's your perspective on how we sort of create a synergy between collective bargaining and public policy to provide the kind of protection our members need?
It's such a great question because really the major players in this space are people that are not parties to our collective bargaining agreements. I think it starts with copyright law, which I'll say we are woefully behind the eight ball on holding the copyright holders accountable for allowing that work to be ingested. And then once it's ingested, I think you're already at a disadvantage, right? It's already there, and I think we saw that in earlier iterations of technology, that it gets to a certain point, and then the answer is, well, wait, we can't stop now. It's a vaguely familiar ring to it. And so that's one of our challenges. You know, we're looking at things like individual rights of action right now, again, because the copyright holder is the person who controls the material, the individual, the impacted director, the impacted actor, etc. They don't have any individual right of action. They can't protect themselves. They can't protect the integrity of their work or attribution. And so those are the kind of things that Europe is well ahead of us on. And I think, you know, you might have noticed it's an odd time in Washington, D.C., so I'm not entirely sure. What?
I don't know what you're talking about.
Not entirely sure what the entry point is in this moment in time, but I think ultimately there has to be some federal legislation, and I think that all of the unions are talking amongst themselves about what approaches might bear the most fruit.
That's a great point. And one of the things that actually concerns me about this is, at least I'm detecting a bit of a reversal in the trend that I was happy about up until recently, which was, I think, an appropriate level of concern about the impact of AI. And now I'm starting to detect this gold rush mentality that has been there in the corporate world, now starting to pervade some of the public policy world as well, where countries and not even just countries, but other sort of legislative units, whether it's states or other areas, are starting to worry that they're going to miss out on the AI gold rush, and therefore they don't want to put things in place. And I was just at a summit in France like a few weeks ago, where people were expressing this concern and saying that the EU moved too fast with the EU AI Act because it's too restrictive and that they need to pull back from that, et cetera. And maybe I'll toss this to you, Sam. What do you think about that? And how does that tie into this whole idea that AI is a democratizing technology? Do you agree with that?
I don't. I think that, here's the thing, is that I think that it can be. I think everybody here has probably had fun playing around with ChatGPT or Sora or your AI of choice. And I think that AI can, when deployed that way, it's a useful tool. I also think that there are ways in which it can be used responsibly in ways that are democratizing. But what I worry about from a writer's perspective, when you think about the stories that we are told through Hollywood, through film and television, is that those stories come from right now a narrow group of people, to be sure, but from a wider group of people than folks who make business decisions at film and television studios. And what I worry about is that the goodies, right? The kind of the fun that I think we've probably all had with ChatGPT at some point, that is being sold as a democratizing technology, while the end result is more likely to be trying to give a very small handful of people the right to decide what stories are told. If they could cut the people who challenge us and who push us and who imagine new things out of the picture, they can end up with products that are more easily sold and digested and monetized and commercialized. And I think the question that we all have to ask ourselves is if AI has never had its heart broken or never lost a job or never had a best friend betray them, is AI ever going to surprise us? And so from our perspective, while we think that AI can be a tool, we still want the stories to be coming from and rooted in human experience so that we can push further and not just have retellings of stories that have already been told.
I think one of my, and I've said this before and I'll say it again, one of my favorite picket signs was, the Writers Guild had the best picket sign, hands down. In fact, on our current strike against the video game companies, we have asked the Writers Guild, feel free to contribute some fun picket sign slogans. But one of them, I think the best one was ChatGPT doesn't have childhood trauma. And so, I think what it really highlights is the human condition is unique and can't be replicated by just feeding inputs into an algorithmic process that just generates an output. Otherwise, you get rehashed the same thing. Where does the next truly creative, unique idea come from? Probably, most likely not from that process. But if it does, but it also ties into what Rebecca was saying earlier, because there are tools that are based on this AI technology that can help creative talent, whether it's writers, filmmakers, actors, crew members, cinematographers, possibly, do their job in a way that's new, but that they really like to engage with. And I think that's something we probably all have to balance, right?
Absolutely.
Is that true in your experience, Vanessa?
Yeah. Now I realize that you all aren't intimately familiar with my union. Why would you be? We represent the below the line crew, and it's a wide variety of crafts, which, as you can imagine, makes negotiations a delicious joy. So you've got cinematographers who are chomping at the bit to play with these technologies and help enhance their images. And you have animators who are like, I never want to hear about AI ever. And it's a very broad spectrum, and it's very valid. I think that there are some good possibilities with AI. There are some very scary possibilities with AI. So something in our world that we've looked at is a provision we got in our contract, and this seems almost ridiculous, where we got a bit that says an employee may request to discuss with the producer the use of AI prior to beginning the work. And you're like, well, yeah, of course people can talk to each other. But sometimes you'd be surprised that they're like, just do it. And they're like, it actually says in here we should have a conversation. And the studios were interested in the fact that all of us here, we are the subject matter experts. They hire us for a reason. And if they are just like, we'd like you to use this AI product in creating this graphic or whatever it may be. That person, that graphic artist may say, it actually will take me a lot longer to use a little bit of AI to avoid any issue with copyright. I can really make this very quickly in a traditional way. Do you mind if I try it that way first? And the studios were like, we want that collaboration. We don't want to be going the wrong direction. If you know a better direction, you are the subject matter experts. And to the issue of copyright, if you are all filmmakers or any of you are filmmakers, the copyright issue to the studios is a very big deal. And it's actually, for our folks, been good in that they were horrified, the studios, in negotiations to hear some stories of folks saying, oh, I was just told if I changed a picture 30%, no problem. And they were like, you were what? Who told you that? Because they're not on the set, they're the intellectual property lawyers at the studios. They're pretty bigwigs. They're not spending the time down in the trenches, pre-production, production, post-production. So they don't hear the conversations and decisions that are being made. So they really did want to hear from our folks and work with our people, because if something isn't copyrightable, if Superman's suit, anyone can make it and you don't own it anymore, that's very bad. So they're being cautious and they're being careful with AI. And I would encourage you as well. There are some very interesting case studies actually about AI artwork and how the Copyright Office has been like, nope. And they're like, but I spent 4 weeks with just prompts and just redoing it. And they're like, not human made. Nope, not copyrightable. And there's some very good case studies. I encourage you to go check those out. So there is an interesting intersection right now as the studios figure out how much AI are they comfortable with using, and our folks figuring out when is AI actually the right tool for the job? We have so many great tools. Is this the right tool in this moment?
I'm so glad that you mentioned the Copyright Office. The Copyright Office just recently released a new white paper on this topic. And, some of us, including myself, are concerned that there may be a softening in the U.S. Copyright Office's position. The position of the Copyright Office has been, I think, quite correct and also quite strong up until this point about, if there is a significant use of AI technology in the creation of a work, that part of the work or perhaps the entire work won't be eligible for registration. And at least I am detecting a slight softening in that positioning.
What do you think could have done that, Duncan?
I can't imagine why.
Why?
But I do want to say, that's a really important line that needs to be drawn because, their original position, which has been upheld by courts because it actually has been litigated, is that the constitutional underpinnings of copyright are specifically attributed to human authorship, and that is not meant to encompass non-human authorship, including algorithmic creations or other kinds of mechanical or machine-based creations. And I think that is really important because copyright as a concept is something that is intended to protect for a period of time the ability of someone to exploit their creative output. But that's based on the persons to encourage people to focus on creativity. And actually, the U.S. Copyright Office's position, I think, has started to permeate globally. And I sure hope that they do not, in fact, soften that position, because I think it is a really important line that needs to be drawn about the difference between human creativity and AI model outputs. Creative process with AI, a little bit different for the members of each of our unions. I don't think any of our unions have taken the position ban AI. We haven't, although I can assure you that some of our members would like us to. I can't tell you the exact percentage, but let's call it 10% of SAG-AFTRA members would like us to attempt to ban the use of AI in the entertainment industry for digital replication, synthetic performers, all that stuff. But that's not the position we've taken, both for practical reasons as well as for the reasons that have been articulated about working. Some people want to experiment and explore, including performers, with this technology. Some very high-profile performers have done this. How does that play out with each of your memberships? Like, do they feel like AI can really be positive, and are you doing something specific to foster that as opposed to bad AI? Rebecca, you want to start?
I'll start because I suspect that our members are probably on the far end of that spectrum. We have a committee of very high-profile directors who are looking at this and talking about the ways in which it can be used to enhance artistry, and we've had directors who have been on the cutting edge of technology for decades, right? You think of some of the stuff James Cameron did, Robert Zemeckis. There are plenty of examples of directors who have used technology to enhance artistry, and I think everyone is just mindful of the real risk, right? Which is that something that enhances artistry, but also isn't used to cut costs or eliminate jobs, and that's the sweet spot that I think unions for sure, and most members of unions hope for. And I have a lot of confidence in their ability to sort of make that distinction. The real question is, can the companies also see it as an artistic tool without also pushing it as a cost-saving tool? And I think that is to be determined. If you'd asked me when we bargained where we'd be on AI, I would have told you I thought we would know a lot more by now, because it seemed to be moving at the speed of light, and now it's moving at the speed of much slower light. And and I think we need a little more time to sort of see the evolution.
Yeah, it's a spectrum for us for sure. I think the percentage of my membership who would like to ban it outright is somewhat north of 10%, but it's not everybody. And I think that probably the most common, use for our folks is using it the same way that somebody would use a search engine, viewed as more efficient. Some of the writing tools that our members use are increasingly starting to incorporate it into like those platforms. We're not entirely sure what the usage is, but I think that one of the challenges with our members using these tools is that, there are all these interesting programs that are really attractive to a writer who's trying to figure things out. There are programs where you can put a script in and it'll give you back 5 or 6 pages of notes. There are, those kind of tools, but every single one of them, if you use them, you are giving that work product to the model to train it. And so I think that for our folks, because this is work that is happening typically alone in a room staring at a blank screen, they have a slightly different creative relationship with it, and those risks are just there. There's no way for our members to use those without also giving something away. And so what we're trying to do is just educating our folks so that they're mindful of the trade-offs. Under the MBA, the minimum basic agreement, the AI cannot be accredited writer, which means it can't displace our members, but I do still think that there are risks in using it. And so we just want people to be able to make informed choices in how they use those tools.
Do you think writers would gravitate to an AI tool where the company gave assurances that the inputs that they're providing weren't being incorporated into training the foundational model?
I think some might. I also think that there's a real market opportunity for companies that can really get right protecting PDFs and documents from AI tools. I think that's something there too. But there are some anti-AI hardliners. If anybody wants to Google like David Simon AI, David Simon's one of our very good members. There are people who don't want it anywhere near their room, anywhere near their screenplays. But it's not universal. And so I think the more ethical these tools can be, the more likely they are to be used.
And let me turn to you, Vanessa. I mean, I think it's interesting because when I think about this, I think about there is just as much potential impact on the various sort of crew roles that IATSE represents in terms of both the ability to want to use them, and I've heard some examples from you and your colleagues of some of your members who are interested in using certain aspects of AI to facilitate their work, and also very real concern about replacement. How do you navigate that?
There's a few pieces here. One is beginning to recognize the areas where AI may be most disruptive and destructive. Like, will the grip and electric on set be as impacted as quickly as, say, some of the folks in animation, post-production, sound, people who work very closely with computers, maybe don't have as much human interaction in their job. So we are identifying those and how are those tools being introduced. The second part is union contracts are ever evolving. They are always being in preparation, in negotiations, or being implemented, and you're learning from it and you're back in preparation. It is a never-ending cycle. I can't believe how quickly 3 years goes by. I never used to think that till I worked for a union. But before we know it, it'll be like, okay, we've got our technology subcommittee. We've got all these, everybody's starting to work and just foment ideas. And that's really planning then for the next round of negotiations. You get a foundational base. We all got our first time AI language. Now we start building that house. We start figuring out where are the issues, how can we set guardrails, what can we achieve, what is realistic, what is important to the members, how do we combine it all together in synthesis. And one of the ways you do that is your folks on set, they're the front line. They need to know if you hear something, if you have a concern, you need to report it up the food chain so we can start gathering all these stories. Because if I don't know about it and something bad is happening, it's not going to get to negotiations. So a lot of our locals, because I'm the international, part of the international, we have a lot of locals around the country. They can be craft specific, like the Cinematographers Guild that I'm a part of, or they can be jurisdictional, where you'll have everybody's in that local because they live in, say, Atlanta. So everyone has a different level of how they are dealing with AI because it impacts different crafts differently. But a lot of our locals have technology subcommittees that are really starting to look at what's specific to them, what's coming to them, and then we'll all start to come together putting those ideas together. So the next round of negotiations, as Rebecca said, I don't have a crystal ball, but I think we're going to start to core down, and it'll be a really interesting time to look at as how fast is it moving at that point? Was it all hype? Was some hype? Was some not hype? Where are we going to end up? It's following the trends. It's following the copyright issues, because that impacts all creative people. If your creative work can just get yoinked and you just have nothing you can say about it, that would be absolutely terrible and is much bigger than any union agreement. So it's all these pieces. You're constantly thinking about it. I'm having ridiculous conversations all the time, like, what are you hearing? Oh, what happened? Oh, so-and-so, oh, that, okay. And I'm just making notes, and everyone I know in my organization is doing the same, because we all have the same question: where exactly is this going?
Yeah, I mean, if we could know for certain where this was going, that would really help. So if anyone out there can tell us for sure where this is going, please let us know afterwards. We'll be right here. But I don't think, like everything in life, we were talking about this as AI, like it's one thing. Of course, this is a term for convenient discussion and to, of course, hype it up and get all of you to come here and listen. But in reality, there's lots of different sort of variations on this technology. And in my members' world, its implementation is happening at widely varying pace, speed. If we talk about voice actors in particular, that is happening very fast. It is already happening. If you don't believe me, just go online, go to any of the AI companies that are actually putting out there for commercial use synthetic voices, not just replicas of actual actors, but actually generative AI created synthetic voices that are being offered up to do various things. This is causing great disruption and concern amongst voice actors who do things like dubbing from foreign languages into English or English into foreign language, who do other types of voice work for even commercials, for example, which is a contract. Literally, I flew here from commercials negotiations, and that's certainly a topic of real concern. Then in other areas, it hasn't moved as fast as we might have feared. In 2023, we did a panel track at CS. SAG-AFTRA sponsored a panel track, and we had an AI futurist who was on one of our panels who said within 6 months, every entertainment industry production is going to have a significant utilization of AI. Think that was overstating it. It was not the case, and clearly from our conversations with the companies that we can't talk about any of the details of this, but broad brush, there is a certain level of caution that's being used in how this plays out. But it is really happening. It's a question of when, not if, at least from the actor's point of view, from the performer's point of view. And if you are a voice actor, the when is now, and you have to be concerned about it now. Having said that, there are companies who are making choices to do things in a better way than others. For example, there's a company who I've mentioned in several other forums, and I'll mention them here. It's called Flawless AI. And one of the things I really like about what they're doing is in developing the technology that they've developed, which is intended to let you modify facial movements to make dubbing more effective and to adjust ratings and things like that. They have, number one, specifically refused to work with synthetic voices and continue to ensure that dubbing actors aren't replaced by synthetic voices. It's actually making dubbing better, not making dubbing free of humans. And so that's something that's really great. And another thing that they've done that I really love, and there's a demo of this on YouTube you can see if you want to look at it, is they have built tools to implement the informed consent concept. So these are plugins that go into Avid, for example, Final Cut, where there is a consent process that's built in so that, because it's one thing to say that you should get consent, and then there's another thing for, let's say, an IATSE, person who's working on editing of something or whatever, to actually have a mechanism to do that. So having that built into the technology that's being used to edit these projects, where there is a workflow to secure the performer's consent for modifications that are being made using an AI tool. Those are the kinds of things that really are the positive side of this, the side that says, okay, people are integrating the idea of informed consent into the process. And I think that's really important, especially in the indie community, because we've talked a lot about the major studios. They were at the forefront of these negotiations for a lot of obvious reasons. But I think there's probably a lot of people here who are involved in the more indie community. But the principles are the same. And the principles of informed consent and fair compensation are the same, regardless of if you're making, in our case, an ultra low budget project, or if you're making a $100 million budget studio film, because the concept of people getting the right to control the use of their image, likeness, and voice, and having real informed consent, which means not that form that probably every one of you, if you're in this business in any way, you've probably seen this form, right? This is the consent form that people sign that says, I hereby consent to the use of my image, likeness, or voice in perpetuity throughout the universe by any means of technology now known or hereafter invented, and sign here, right? People have been given this form for decades. I don't know who wrote it originally, but whatever lawyer that is, if they had gotten residuals, they would be, they'd be in Malibu now. Maybe they are. But that's no good anymore, right? As far as AI goes, as far as SAG-AFTRA is concerned, forget that. Those days are over, because it is not real consent to just sign a form that says someone can just own you. Because that's what that form means when you have this capability. Because if you sign that, and now they can create anything they want with your image, likeness, and voice forever, what does that mean? How do you now have any control over your own persona anymore? You don't. So that consent is no longer acceptable, and I'm really glad that we've gotten that embedded in California law, and I think we're going to continue to build on that. Rebecca, yeah.
I just wanted to raise one thing, which I think is a companion with consent, and it's record keeping, right? Here we are in a world where all of this material is being fed into these various entities. And the truth is, if we don't know what goes in, we don't have any mechanism to talk about the value to the work, the people who did there is no consent and there is no compensation if there is no record of what is built into the system. And I think it's not the sexiest topic in the world, but it is foundational to being able to administer consent and compensation model. And I do think the actors are on the front line, which is why I want you to take care of this for us as soon as possible.
I mean, that's like one of the hardest things to actually negotiate for, if I'm being honest, because nobody wants to do it. It's a big issue in our video game negotiations, because one of the things those companies do not want to do is keep track of what they did with AI and how they've used people's performances to create other things. So I really appreciate you mentioning that. If the genie from Aladdin came to you and said, you have one wish, and you can put anything you want into one of your collective bargaining agreements regarding AI or into public policy, what is it? What's your number one thing that you would use your genie wish to get? Vanessa, can I start with you?
Oh, yeah. Let's freeform this one, guys. Let's do it.
Just surprise them with this. This is the mean moderator tactic.
We always have to keep in mind that this is a global industry, but I'm going to pretend that it's not. If there's a genie floating in front of me, things are weird, or I've ingested something that somebody has given me. So I would say if there was anything I could get in a collective bargaining agreement, it would be really that we get final say in certain topics, that it's not the employer gets to have final say, it's the union representing the worker gets to have final say in how something is implemented. I think that would be my dream wish with a genie asking me that question.
Okay, Sam.
I would ask the genie, make sure that the genie's comfortable with their working conditions, but I do, the lamp not too cramped and everything. Unions mostly don't represent folks pre-hire. And I think that if I were talking to a genie, I think what I would want to be thinking about is AI as a screening tool for opportunities. One of the things that I'm worried about is that AI is not going to be used to displace my members, but to choose which of my members get to have their things read by the humans that make decisions. And my concern on that is really a concern for all of us, right? Because if you train an AI to look for only, the most successful movies of the last 50, 60 years, it is going to be trained to look for movies that were primarily written by and for a certain kind of person, middle class, upper middle class, rich white men, right? And I think that if that becomes a screening tool, that decides which scripts get in front of executives, which scripts get to be greenlit, which scripts get to move forward, that we are all going to be much poorer for it because we're not going to be surprised, because we're not going to get the story that we didn't see coming. So, and I think that can be analogized to all of our professions. I think generally speaking, when we apply for a job, we want to be evaluated by a human and not by artificial intelligence. So since it's a genie, I would probably do policy as opposed to collective bargaining.
Fair enough.
I think it's all part of the same answer, which is a way of honoring the artist and the art. And the artist and the art, everything that everyone who, the workers that all of us represent, the artists that we represent. And I think, integrity and attribution, the kind of individual right to protect your own work and the integrity of that work. And I think we sometimes only think about that at the highest level, but I can assure you that every person I've ever represented feels a very special attachment to the value that they bring to the project. And so somehow, and I think that, capitalism and the world we live in make this harder and harder, but this idea that the actual value of what human beings bring to work has meaning and has dignity, and I wish collective bargaining agreements could capture that more effectively and protect it more effectively.
I guess for me, if I could, and I don't even know which it fits into, I guess it's more policy, or just reality, which is I would really love for the capabilities of AI to be directed to areas where I feel like they can make a more positive contribution to the world in general and to society in general. I'm constantly asking myself, why is so much money, effort, and energy being directed into using AI to replicate my members' image, voice, and likeness instead of more of it being directed to curing cancer or any one of 1,000 other social problems that I feel like maybe there's some possible utility of AI to do. And so I do feel like that would be great if we could find a way to really come to a consensus on where this technology ought to be deployed. Just because you can do something doesn't mean you should do something. And sometimes there's something else you should do instead. And I think some of these tools are great for enhancing creativity. I'm not down on them for that. But I do think the name of efficiency, it's so funny. I've been in so many AI-related conversations with big groups of corporate leaders because there's usually 100 of them and one of us in this room, right? And the constant buzzword is efficiency. And a few of them mean that in a way that I could maybe get on board with. But most of them, what that means is just getting rid of people, having less people doing things, and saving, making more money for shareholders, which great for shareholders, love them to make money. But there is a real value to the dignity of work. We need to think about where this is all going in our society in general. And I really do believe that we all of us who care about this need to always remember that it is people who make these decisions, and those people, should be and are accountable for their decisions. So the AI is not implementing itself. People are choosing how AI is implemented, and we ought to all really raise our voices and participate in that discussion. And if we don't, then shame on us if we don't like the outcomes, if we haven't even tried to do what we can to help move this in the right direction. So hopefully that'll be true for everybody. I just want to thank so much the panelists who all came in here from various places to be here. Thank you so much. Have a great South by.
The SAG-AFTRA podcast is produced and edited by Aaron Goddard and John Small. Supervising producers are Pamela Greenwald, Shira Reich, and Michael McNulty, with production and marketing support from Damon Romine, Jolie Cocante, Delaney Howard, Margot Giordano, Joe Mulgado, May Wong. The podcast is hosted by yours truly, Duncan Crabtree Ireland.